Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Ben Cole, Executive Editor at Information Week. More companies are implementing artificial intelligence in business processes, but it's easy to get caught up in the hype and forget that there are risks involved, and these risks must be mitigated to ensure AI project success. I'm joined today by Daryle Serrant, a technologist, AI consultant, and educator with over a decade of experience building innovative solutions for startups and enterprise clients. He is also an author of courses on generative AI and data science. So much for joining me again today, Daryle.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Of course. Daryle, in our last interview, you mentioned that companies need to be aware of hidden costs and risk of AI projects. What are some of these risks that companies might be forgetting about when implementing AI?
Absolutely. Many companies focus heavily on building the AI model, but they forget to plan for what happens after deployment. And that's a problem because every AI project, whether it's big one or small one, they come with ongoing costs and risks that don't always show up on day one. And one risk that we talked about in our last conversation was data quality. A lot of AI projects get delayed or scrapped altogether because the data turns out to be messier and less reliable than they expected. And teams often really underestimate the amount of time that's needed to clean, scope out the data, and really make sure they can maintain high quality data sets in the long term. So another big risk that I see is model drift. And even the best AI models degrade over time as customer behaviors, market conditions, and even threat landscapes change. And if companies aren't actively monitoring the performance of their models and retraining when necessary, that high value that they saw at the beginning of their project could suddenly slowly degrade over time, and they won't really notice it until something happens or some problem happens, and they get hit something right in the face. Regulatory risk is also a growing concern. And in places like, so things like the EU AI Act that's currently in place, and with new laws starting to emerge from the cracks in the US, companies with no proper procedures or testing protocols in place, they can suddenly be hit with fines, lawsuits, and also regulatory procedures unexpectedly. And that could also pause a lot of the AI initiatives that they may have been planning. So the big message here is this: AI isn't a set it and forget it policy. It's not a set it and forget it technology. The hidden risks can show up much later, either during production or during audits. And that time, the cost to fix it would be much higher than it would have otherwise been if they were actively managing it and taking actions on it in the beginning.
Absolutely. And Daryle, what exactly is model drift, and what are some of the ways that companies can avoid the risks that come with it, especially as tech and threats evolve so quickly?
Yeah, so model drift, it happens when an AI model's performance starts to degrade over time. And that's because the world it was trained on just suddenly changes. So, in the business world, things change really quickly. Customer behaviors shift, the marketing conditions change, and threats become more sophisticated. And the model code certainly hasn't changed, but the patterns it was trained on just starts to shift. And a great real world example of this is what happened to Zillow back in 2021. So at the time, Zillow had an AI that was using to help figure out properties to buy. And over time, so during that time, the market conditions shifted, and their AI wasn't really able to keep up. So what ended up happening was that Zillow started spending money on sending to all these ended up spending money on a lot of properties, and that caused them to lose thousands, hundreds of millions of dollars in costs, and it ended up shutting down an entire business line. So this is a kind of a textbook case of model drift, and basically what happened there was that their AI assumptions just didn't no longer match reality. So how can companies manage that risk? So one way they can manage that risk is to set up real-time monitoring of both the model's performance metrics and input data distributions. And and ideally, if there's a shift in either of these, their team should be alerted immediately so it can actually investigate it. And there are plenty of AI observability tools in the market that they can be used to automatically monitor these kind of changes and kick off investigations. AI models also need to be retrained regularly, and this is especially the case for fast-changing environments like e-commerce, finance, and cybersecurity. And one last thing, for AI models that impact high stakes decisions, it's also useful to have a human in the loop. And one good example of that would be fraud detection at a bank. So let's say, for example, a bank has an AI model that's being used to flag or detect fraudulent transactions, suspicious transactions. And it works really well most of the time. But let's say, for example, it comes across a transaction that it hasn't seen before. The patterns just don't match. It doesn't match what it's seen in training, or it's not very confident in its classification. So this will be a case where that transaction could be passed on to a human fraud analyst for review before any action is taken, whether that's if that includes maybe contacting the customer for them to review the transaction. So that way, the AI is being used to handle a lot of the cases that are known, and for cases that are kind of unknown or uncertain, have a high degree of risk, a human could come in and actually capture that, and that can reduce likelihood of fraud detection, of false positives, or even missing actual cases of fraud. So at the end of the day, model drift is inevitable, but it's manageable if companies treat their AI systems as living, breathing assets that require ongoing care and governance.
And you also mentioned data quality challenges. How can companies ensure the information they use to feed these AI projects remains accurate and AI ready and of course, unbiased?
Yes, so data quality is one of the most, as I mentioned before, it's one of the most underestimated and overlooked risks in AI projects. And even the most sophisticated AI model will fail if the data it's being fed with isn't clean, isn't consistent, and even representative. So before starting any AI project, I would recommend companies to do a thorough data audit. And what that means is making sure that the data is it has no missing values. It's very consistent. There's no outliers, and there's no potential sources of bias. And a data audit means more than just making sure that there's no errors. It also means really understanding the data, understanding where it comes from, how it was collected, and whether it's actually can be used to solve the business problem, whether it actually matches the environment you want your AI to perform in. So clear data ownership is also important. Companies should appoint different teams or individuals who will be responsible for making sure that the data quality is up to snuff. Make sure that the data, the quality and integrity of their data is good. It's manageable. Because without this clear ownership, the data quality of their data sets will tend to degrade over time as new data sources get added, new business processes come in, and their systems change. It's also be helpful for companies to invest in tools that could automatically monitor changes in their data, look for anomalies, look for duplicates, look for any changes in their schema that's being done by their engineers, or any unexpected patterns. Because by catching these upfront early on, before they get fed downstream into AI, they can prevent a slew of problems later on that can bite them in the butt later on. So for more sensitive applications like lending, hiring, or customer service, it might also be helpful for companies to perform regular bias and fairness audits. So tools like IBM's AI Fairness 360 could be useful to help detect whether their AI is actually being unfair to some of their customers. So ultimately, investing in strong data governance and monitoring upfront saves companies much higher costs and risk down the line, whether that's financial loss, damage to their reputation, or even like regulatory penalties.
Also, I read recently that that easy enterprise access to cloud services simplifies the deployment of sophisticated AI systems, but it also risks over engineering. What should companies do to avoid over engineering risk when it comes to AI?
Yeah, that's a great observation. The rise in cloud-based AI tools have definitely lowered the barrier for many companies who would have otherwise shut out because they're not, they don't have the infrastructure like companies like Google or Amazon. But that's a very good thing. But there's also created a temptation to over engineer. And by that, I mean, companies are coming on and they're building these overly complex AI solutions that are very costly to run in production. They're very fragile and they don't always deliver the business value that a much more simpler solution would provide. So how can companies kind of avoid that trap? So the first step would be to kind of take a step back and start with the business problem, not the technology. So before jumping into any algorithms or tools, you want to take some time to figure out what's the problem you're trying to solve. What outcome are you trying to achieve? And sometimes when doing that, sometimes you'll find, and I find this sometimes when I talk to some of my potential clients that I talk to about AI, that sometimes they don't need a complex AI algorithm. They just need a simple rules-based system, or maybe a dashboard, or even some simple process automation, and that could actually solve their problem much more effectively at a much lower cost. So that's step one. So the step two is, once you've figured out the solution, establish a business problem you want to solve, you want to go for a minimum viable model approach. So that looks like, rather than, going straight to deep learning or LLMs or any of the new latest and greatest AI models that you're hearing on the news or in the media, you want to start with that kind of simplest model that'll deliver acceptable value. And once you've proven that, then you can start thinking about, okay, how can I add more complexity? And again, that'll be only if your business case truly justifies it. So then talking more towards that end, as you start thinking about more and adding more complexity, you want to ask yourself, whether that's, building a more powerful model, a larger data pipeline, or a more expansive infrastructure. You want to ask yourself, does this new layer of complexity I'm adding actually adds proportional business value? And one good practice that could help you kind of enforce that discipline is having a functional review team of your engineers, your best people from IT, finance, and business, who can actually sit down with you and actually look at your solution and say, does this solution actually fit the problem we're trying to solve? So running small pilot projects is also a good practice. So a lot of companies that I see do that, they small pilot projects, little lightweight solutions, so they can actually see, for one, what it does is it allows them to test at a very low risk scale if the assumption that they're making are actually valid before they start investing into more larger infrastructure or even talent to scale it further.
And what about vendor lock-in? Is that an issue when it comes to AI?
Yes. So vendor lock-in is becoming a growing concern in the AI space, especially as more organizations who are kind of adopting AI, they're starting to see the wonders and possibilities that AI can provide. They're starting to rely on a lot more of these more proprietary AI platforms. In a rush to deploy these AI quickly, many companies are building their solutions too tightly around a single vendor's tooling, their APIs, or infrastructure. And what this does is it creates a type of risk where switching to another provider later on can become technically difficult. It can be very time-consuming or financially expensive. So you could think of AI vendor lock-in in three different dimensions. So the first one is cost risk. And once you're committed to a vendor's AI platform and get integrated into their operations, once you integrate their tools into your operations, that vendor essentially has a lot of leverage. So what can happen is that the vendor can later on come out and increase their prices. They can change their licensing terms. They can introduce new usage fees. And what looked like initially when you started the project, what initially looked like as a small little cheap API cost could really turn into. Let me say that again. So what initially looked like a small cheap API initially on at the start of the project can later, years later, turn out to be much more expensive years later. And at that point, the company, because they're so tightly integrated into this vendor, they have very limited options for negotiating or switching because at that point it's too expensive to switch. So vendor lock-in can also be a concern, could be a risk in terms of innovation. So as you know, the AI field is constantly changing. New models are coming on, new products, new companies are emerging with new, better products that compete with other existing vendors. So if you're tightly, deeply integrated into one vendor, let's say, for example, you're using a vendor's NLP service. If later down the line a vendor comes up with another solution that's much better than the vendor you're currently using, switching could require a significant re-engineering and a lot of cost. And this puts you at risk because you have more your competitors who have maybe are more agile can actually switch to this that product sooner because they have an infrastructure that's probably a lot more flexible than they have an AI stack that's a lot more flexible than yours. There's also another risk in terms of operations and continuity. And what I mean by that is, let's say, for example, you're relying on a single vendor. That essentially creates a single point of failure. So if that provider ends up having an outage or deprecates the API that you're using for a critical function in your business, or it pivots to another business strategy, which is very common to a lot of companies, early stage startups in the AI space. You could come to a situation where you experience you could come to a situation where your system could go down, or you have a product that you're building that you don't have any support on. So a good real world example of this was what happened in November of 2023 when OpenAI, which is the maker of ChatGPT, they had their own kind of leadership crisis. And then and when that happened, what happened in that case that the CEO unexpectedly got fired. And when that happened, a lot of the companies that were tightly integrated into OpenAI's infrastructure suddenly went into a panic mode because now they started wondering, okay, well, what's going to happen to the future of this platform that we relied so heavily on? Fortunately, that situation resolved itself, but that was a huge wake-up call for many companies where they start to wonder, what's my continuity plan if my vendor, the vendor that I'm using right now, suddenly changes overnight, and beyond kind of leadership changes, which is kind of the example I gave, concrete example I gave. There's also a concern that of a risk of a vendor being acquired or just suddenly going out of business. So how could companies kind of address that risk? How can they mitigate that risk? So one way would be to design AI solutions to be loosely coupled to one single vendor. So that could look like using containerization tools, open source frameworks as much as possible, or even using standard model formats that allows their system to be basically ported anywhere at any infrastructure. Many organizations are also adopting a hybrid cloud approach or multi-cloud approach. Multi-cloud approach. So for AI, this could mean training the models on one particular platform and maybe deploying it on another, or even using multiple vendors depending on a particular AI task that they want to perform. So like maybe one vendor for their chatbot, one vendor for image detection, object detection, and so on and so on and so on. So yes, this does add a bit of complexity, but it also gives these companies more leverage, more breathing room, and more importantly, it reduces the single point of failure. So from a governance perspective, it's also crucial. It's also important to kind of negotiate contracts that protect your company's data ownership and guarantee more data portability. And it also gives them clear exit strategies. So some companies are even negotiating for transition periods in case they ever need to migrate their data off platform. So in summary, like I said a lot, vendor lock-in isn't just a technical issue, it's also a financial and strategic risk. So companies that can manage it well are those that are built for flexibility and can negotiate with long-term resilience in mind.
That was excellent, Daryle. It definitely gives our listeners a lot to think about and all these risks. Before we wrap up, is there any final takeaways that you want to talk about that you want people to remember?
Yeah, so I think the biggest takeaway from everything that I talked about is that AI can absolutely drive business value, but only if companies go in and at it with their eyes both eyeballs wide open. About the hidden risks and ongoing responsibilities when it comes to with AI. And it isn't, like I mentioned, like a one-time project, like a set it forget it project. It's a living, breathing system. Think about it as a kid, a child. That needs continuous monitoring, data quality management, risk assessment, and also governance. So when you're looking at building these AI products, you want to ask yourself not just how accurate is your model today, but also what can happen tomorrow. How can it perform tomorrow? What's our risk if it fails? Or think about do some scenario assessments. Think about, okay, what if this vendor I'm using shuts down now? What opportunities, what alternatives do we have available that could actually match that risk? What processes in place do we have to detect and kind of fix these problems early? So ultimately, the companies that succeed in AI won't just be the most innovative. They'll also be the ones that are most disciplined about managing AI as an operational, financial, and strategic risk.
Again, Daryle, that was excellent. Thank you so much for your insight today. I appreciate it. For more
Yeah,
on
thank
how
you.
AI is, of course, thank you. For more on how AI is influencing modern business, please visit informationweek.com. Thank you for watching.